So, guys, welcome back to the Let's Talk Boxing podcast from SimBoxx. Delighted to be back. It's been a busy year. There's been ups and downs in and out of the ring, and the podcast took a back seat. But what better time to get back into things? Arguably the best fight week we've had in a long time. It started today, Tuesday, July 25th, with Stephen Fulton against Naoya Inoue, the unified super bantamweight world title fight. It's leading into Saturday, the fight of the week, the fight of the year, the fight of the decade in Terence Crawford against Errol Spence Jr. The undisputed welterweight title fight finally goes down, and we're back. Let's Talk Boxing is back. I'm your host, as always, Luke SimBoxx. Delighted to announce my new co-host with the podcast moving forward. You would have seen him around on social media. He's one of the best up-and-coming boxing journalists out there. He's got his own channel, Josh Hart from JTH Boxing. Welcome to the Let's Talk Boxing podcast.
Luke, first of all, I just want to say thank you for giving me this opportunity. For people who see my channel, every Monday or Tuesday, I'll make a big video where I just ramble on. So no better way to up the levels than be joined by someone and do it. So I can't thank you enough for this opportunity. I'm sure we're going to have many great podcasts.
Absolutely. It's the start of a good journey, but we'll get straight into it. This morning, Tuesday morning in the UK, morning breakfast was accompanied by one of the fights of the year in Stephen Fulton, unified super bantamweight champion, pound for pound ranked himself, and he come up against Naoya, the monster Inoue, and he's now a 4-weight world champion. He's undisputed champion at bantamweight. He's the holder of the Muhammad Ali trophy. The superlatives that you can throw at Inoue are never ending. What a fighter. For me, he's pound for pound number one. We'll get on to that. But he destroyed Stephen Fulton inside 8 rounds. And for me, Josh, I think this epitomized with Inoue that he's not just this power puncher. I think some people try and label him as a one-hitter quitter the way they do with Deontay Wilder. I think you could class him more like Golovkin, where they've got that boxing pedigree. They've got them strong boxing fundamentals, the ring IQ. He's not just a power puncher. It's disrespectful to consider him just a power puncher. And it was all on display against Stephen Fulton, who's a world-class fighter in his own right. But when you have your world-class, then you have that 1% at the top. And Inoue's in the top of the 1%. He's that good. It was an 8-round clinic. And then the stoppage in the 8th round was the cherry on the top. I was super impressed. I was in work at the time. I was stopping and starting and ducking and diving, but I made sure I caught as much of the fight as I could. And most importantly, I caught the stoppage. It was clinical. It was effortless, and it was brutal. How impressed was you with Naoya Inoue today, Josh?
I thought it was punch perfect, if I'm being brutally honest. Like, he made Fulton look like respectfully bang average. Like, he didn't do an awful lot at all. You know, when I was sat there watching it, I was scoring out on my phone and I didn't give a single round to Fulton. So when I'm looking at these judges' scorecards, and obviously we'll get into judges later because I'm sure we've got a lot to talk about when it comes to judges. One of the judges gave Fulton 2 rounds, and I could sit there and go watch this fight again 10 times before I go to bed tonight, and I won't be able to see which rounds they've given to Fulton because he just didn't do a lot. And that's not because of through any fault of his own. It's because Inoue was just that good. He was trying to counter punch, but I'm not being funny. You can't counter punch a man who's stronger, but not only stronger, but a lot faster. You could see his speed was on display. That jab, and he had his head down, just jabbing, and Fulton couldn't deal with it. He literally just could not deal with it. Then that finish in the 8th round was just beautiful. I was hitting with that clean right. I think he touched down a little bit, had a little touchdown, and that left hook he came back with. I'm surprised he got up from that, to be honest. I'm sure if that was anyone else in that division, I think they would have stayed down for longer than 10 seconds.
Absolutely. I think that not only in the fact that he got up in the 8th round and he tried to continue as a brave defending champion, Stephen Fulton, but he deserves a lot of credit for one, taking the fight. He's been inactive. So to take that fight after 13 months out, then for the fight to be delayed, he could have insisted there that he wants a warm-up, a tune-up fight. He didn't. He said, we'll rearrange the date. So massive props to Stephen Fulton. I'm sure he'll come back, and if Inoue unifies, becomes undisputed, and then moves up again and the titles fragment, or if Stephen Fulton moves up, which he probably will, I could see him certainly winning a world title at a high weight class. It seems now with Inoue that it's almost opened people's minds, similar to with Canelo when he won at middleweight, he won at super middleweight, then he went up to light heavyweight and he knocked out Sergey Kovalev. And then all of a sudden, we're talking, is Canelo going to go to cruiserweight and fight Lungu Makabu? Then there was the absurd thought that Canelo was going to go up to a catch weight of 201 pounds and fight Usyk. And then it all come crashing down around him when he was beaten soundly by Dimitri Bivol. That is the feeling I'm getting now with Inoue, that he's got this aura of invincibility. The difference being is that we'd seen Canelo lose before and come close to losing. We've not seen Inoue be troubled. He got caught today with shots from Fulton, clean shots. I think it was round 5. He got caught with a 1-2 and he brushed it off. When he's been hurt by a big puncher like Nonito Donaire, suffered a broken nose and a shattered orbital bone, he battled through that. So we've seen him overcome adversity. He's ticking all these boxes. And it seems now that the possibilities are opening up that, is he going to go to fight Robsy Ramirez, or is he going to go and fight Oscar Valdez, or is he, even people, which seems absurd to me, are talking about a catchweight with Gervonta Davis somewhere down the line. The possibilities seem endless for Inoue, but I think the only thing that's going to beat him at this point is size, because anyone in and around his weight, they're not going to stand up to, one, the power, and more importantly, the boxing ability. He can play chess with you, or he can knock you out. It's, the two choices are, do you want to go out on your face or your back? That seems to be the choice that Inoue gives you. He's that good. Where do you see this journey of the monster going? I think obviously the logical next step is going to be is it Tapas for the Undisputed?
Yeah, let's fight next. I think that's what's next.
That's logical, but then after that, does he chase greatness at another weight? Could he become a 5-weight world champion, 6-weight world champion? Is he going to continue the path of going up the weight similar to the great Manny Pacquiao?
I think you hit it spot on there. I think he'll keep going up. I think obviously he'll fight Tapas, beat him. Obviously that'll make him undisputed again. And so obviously he's only had 25 fights, but that was, what was it his 20th consecutive world title fight or something like that? He's been fighting for world titles from like the very start. And that's where you kind of just got to sit there and think, when you look at these champions in the weight classes above him, they might have more fights than him, but I can almost guarantee they don't have as many world title fights as him. He's been fighting for world titles since he was 6-0. And that's the thing that blows my mind when you're hearing people say like, oh yeah, we're fighting at this weight. Like for me, obviously you got to look at how low he started down. Was it like 108 he started? Obviously he's already at 122 now. 126 for me. I think he'd beat most people at probably everyone at 126. He could go undisputed there. I think the possibility is endless for him. I do think once it's all said and done for him, and God knows when that'll be, by the way, because he doesn't look like he's how old is he now? I'm not actually sure how old he is.
30.
That's in 30 is not old for a boxer. There's so many boxers around that age who are still going. Look at someone like Joe Joyce, who's 37. He's still at the top of his game. Imagine where I knew he could be at 37. I know obviously there's a bit of a difference between super bantamweight and heavyweight, because obviously weight cuts will get harder. But he'll just keep stepping up in weight. And I'm not being funny. It's not like he's going to blow up to become some sort of massive fat heavyweight. I'm not saying that. But, he can achieve anything he wants at any weight division, I reckon. I reckon we'll see him go all the way up to, I'd say, would 135 even be a stretch too far for him? I think a lot of people would probably say probably not. I think that's where, there's a lot of money fights as well for him. And I think I say money fights for him. I'd say he is the money fight for these smaller guys now. Even the guys in the weight class above him, he's probably the money fight. That you'll see people saying like, oh, they might try and drop down, or if he comes up, all of a sudden all these champions will be trying to get him. They'll want him. He's the money fight. And I think when he has retired, I think we will sit there and say he will be one of the greatest of all time, if not the greatest of all time.
High praise indeed. And like you say, it's right in what you're saying, that he is the money fight in them small divisions, because look at that crowd in Japan, and we know in Asia and that part of the world that they consume their content differently. That in the UK, you got the lads there, and it's party atmosphere, and Sweet Caroline, and the beers are swirling, and it's party atmosphere. In America, they kind of similar to the UK, but then you've got your fans that like to get the popcorn and sit and watch it like they're at the movies. Whereas in Japan, they consume it a little bit different. They're almost observant. There's not much by way of atmosphere, but they come out and they pay the money. That arena today in Tokyo was packed to the rafters, and the atmosphere was great. Every time he landed a punch, there was the oohs and the ahs, and absolutely, he's the money fight them lower divisions, and we know notoriously that those guys down there are not as well paid as their bigger counterparts. If you used to compare like Naoya Inoue, pound for pound number one, and then you've got Errol Spence and Terence Crawford who will come on to, but you could safely say that those guys are earning a lot more money than Inoue will be. So the lower weight classes need those kind of fighters to generate, the once in a lifetime kind of fighters like Inoue is. He's not going to be another Inoue. So yeah, absolutely, he's going to be the money fight, and you could see fighters coming down in weight to get a fight with him and to get that opportunity to go over to Tokyo and try and dethrone him. And if they don't, they're getting very well paid as well. So yeah, highly impressed with Naoya Inoue. I put a tweet out there, interestingly, today, Josh, talking about the fantasy fights that they're becoming now, the likes of Inoue and Tank, which might be one too far at the minute. But I thought if Lomachenko, who's not a fully fledged 135-pounder, the Matrix, he's another generational talent. Imagine if we could get a fight between them two at somewhere like 128 pounds, how freakishly good that would be. Naoya Inoue against Vasily Lomachenko.
I think that would probably be up there. Like, it was one of the best. I think one of those technical fights of all time as well. Because obviously, I know people originally were saying Naoya Inoue was just this, like you said, one hit wonder. He's got that big power. But I think today we saw he's got that ability to just the way he was cutting off that ring against Fulton. It was unbelievable. He didn't give Fulton a single second to breathe in that ring. And I just think putting him and Lomachenko in the same ring, I think it would be one of those fights where you'd see people, like a lot more people, sit around and watch. Because as you realize with these guys who, like, your pound for pound ranked fighters, they become more known by the casual fans. Obviously, when you look at the casual fans, they want to come see a knockout. But there's a lot of casual fans who heard of Lomachenko who's not a knockout artist, And I think you'll see people sit around and actually come and be like, wow, this is a big fight. It's like Tank versus Garcia. I know that was obviously two big hitters, but I think it'd be a fight on that type of magnitude, a catch weight fight, which would have people sit down and people who aren't big boxing fans come and say, wow, I want to watch this fight. I had my mates coming and asking me about the Tank versus Davis fight. Normally, when you see casual fans, they know heavyweight, they don't know anyone else. But they were coming to me and saying, oh, when's this fight happening? Do you want to come watch it together? I think people would say the same thing if Inoue and Lomachenko fought. And I think some people might say I'm wrong just based on the fact Inoue isn't known by the casual fans. But I think sooner or later, or even now, I think now he'll be known by the casual fans.
Absolutely. Now, Josh, with this being the first podcast back in a long time, we want to hit the ground running. So we're going to try and remember when you was a kid and you'd get told off, and teachers are told if you're trying to tell a kid off, you start with something good, get the bad out of the way in the middle, and then end with something good. So everyone feels well and good, and you can go off and enjoy the day. That's what we're going to try and do on this podcast. We start with the good. Inoue Fulton, one of the fights of the year, one of the performances of the year. And we'll end on something good, which will be Terence Crawford and Errol Spence, another potential fight of the year. But in the middle, we've got to get the bad stuff out of the way. And the bad stuff, for me, Josh, is as bad as it gets. I think it was yourself that put a tweet out that compared it to Josh Taylor and Jack Catterall. Of course, I'm alluding to Saturday night out in Oklahoma, I think it was. Maxi Hughes, the Cinderella man, IBO lightweight world champion. He's on a terrific run of form, beating the likes of John O'Carroll. He defeated Kid Galahad. He's on a great run of form, turned his life around, was able to go boxing full time. Not too long ago, he was working on construction sites and things like that. And he gets that big fight, he gets that big opportunity against former unified lightweight champion George Kambosos, who was coming off back-to-back defeats to Devin Haney for the Undisputed titles. And he was robbed, Josh. There's no way dressing this up. Like we say, we'll get the bad stuff out of the way in the middle. It's going to be quite negative. It was bad. It was a majority decision win, and inverted commas win for George Kambosos. One judge had it a draw, which was generous, and then one judge had it 117, 111, and I think the other one was at 115, 113 or something like that. It stunk to high heavens. Josh, I'm going to give you the lead here. I'm going to pass the microphone to you because I know you've been bubbling away at this since we decided to return with the podcast. So your thoughts on Max's performance and ultimately the scoring from those judges.
Right, so I'll start it as positively as possible, and we'll talk about Maxi's performance. Do you know, before I even talk about his performance, I want to talk about Maxi Hughes just as a person. So I'm someone who's followed Maxi Hughes for a little bit of time now, ever since he kind of stepped onto the matchroom scene. As someone who's kind of fascinated by him, so I kind of sat back and wanted to look how his career's gone. And you kind of see someone who's had an up-down type of career, you know. If you were to look at his career before this 7-fight win streak when had 19 wins and 5 losses, you would have never have even thought you'd got a chance to headline in the States. And I mean, you see it as well, you know. I saw Josh Warrington's Instagram post where, you know, apparently he did most things for the Kambosos fight by himself. He got sick of waiting about and he actually went out there and made that fight himself pretty much. So I think for that, you've almost got to take his hat, like, got to take your hat off to him, you know. He's gone out of the way. He's made this big fight for himself. He's agreed to everything on their terms. Gone out to Oklahoma with barely anyone there knowing who he is. Like, you can't sit there. Like, I can't go to Oklahoma on Friday night or let's say Tuesday night before fight weeks even got underway and ask someone, do you know who Maxi Hughes is? They will say no, but you could ask a boxing fan in Oklahoma, do you know who George Kambosos is? And they'll probably say, yeah, you know, we kind of know who he is because of the fights he's been in. Listen, he's left there, like, while he didn't get the result, I think he can hold his head high because he has made Kambosos look bang average. And I've got a thing for saying bang average, but I'm being completely like honest here. He made him look. Let's look at what did Kambosos actually do in that fight. I don't. When I sit there and look at that fight, how can you give 9 rounds to Kambosos? I struggled to even give him 3 rounds. I was speaking to a few people. Some people say, "Oh, 7-5 at best." Name me 5 rounds that he won. I can't name the rounds off the top of my head that I gave to him, but there's definitely not 5. There's 3 at best. And even then, in those 3 rounds, they were close rounds. And I said, for Maxi Hughes to go out there and put on that type of performance, obviously he did it last time out against Kid Galahad. I think the Kid Galahad fight I was in attendance for. He wasn't made to win that fight. Obviously, that fight wasn't scheduled to headline that night. But you could almost see that was the type of fight that Matchroom were putting on for Maxi to, you know, yeah, okay, headline, but for Kid Galahad to get that statement in a new weight division. And he lost because Maxi Hughes decided to go out there and say, you know what, fuck this. At the end of the day, it's the story of his career. When he's been wrote off, he's proved everyone wrong. And he did it just there on Saturday night. He should have been walking away, still with his belt, IBF mandatory, and with countless paydays ahead of him. But instead, he's had to come home with what? People just tweeting about how good he did. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure that's nice to see all the fans saying how well he did, but you can see he's a family man and does a few not a few tweets, there's a lot of tweets saying how well you did and that you got robbed. Is that going to pay your bills? Is that going to, it might just secure him big paydays, don't get me wrong, because he said something in an interview that he said, I think Lou DiBella told him off the back of this one, despite the fact of the result, he's going to get big paydays next, like he'll have a big fight next still. But it's the fact that, you know, he's someone who shouldn't have been in that position, but through his own hard work and his own graft, he's got himself into that position. And I just think to see him get robbed at that level I think it's horrible. I think it's one of those things that really does kill the sport. And I just think, like he says himself, it's not the first time this has happened, and it's not the last. And I think this is where you got to see something done about these judges. Because obviously, I know a lot of people gave George Kambosos a lot of grief, and he's not the man to blame. He's not the man to blame. At the end of the day, did he go to these judges and say, "Score this fight for me"? We don't know what's happened backstage, but from what we can say, he probably didn't. You know, I'm sure he's a fairly respectable fighting man. When are these judges going to start getting held accountable? Because you always look at obviously, I know a lot of stick has gone to this judge who scored it 117, 111. But what about the other 2 judges? You know, you still got to give them the sticks. At the end of the day, I can't even see a draw or 7-5 Kambosos. Why is it just like one judge getting a stick? Why are you not collectively getting all of them and giving them the stick? And I saw a few people saying a couple of suggestions. Maybe we should start putting judges in front of the media and for them to then talk about why they scored it that way. I think if we put judges in front of press and have them talk about why they've explained it that way, I think we'll either see a lot of better scorecards or we'll see a lot of judges shit themselves in front of the cameras. It's one or the other. Because if they keep scoring it like that, trust me, they won't get to judge again. What happened when Ian John Moore Lewis or whatever his name was against Jack Catterall? He got investigated and he got degraded.
But,
I'm hoping to see the same
here. Josh, but even going back to that case with Ian John Lewis, you know, and as the old saying goes, today's news is tomorrow's chip paper. Ian John Lewis, he was brought in and asked to explain his scoring for that fight of Josh Taylor, Jack Catterall. And we use that as an example because that's another glaring. There's been other controversial scorecards. The Lewis Ritzner fight with Vasquez recently as well. So There's a few that you could go back to, but he was brought in to explain that, and we wasn't given a report of what he'd said. We wasn't given what he said and his reasonings for giving it that the way he did, the way he scored the fight. It was like, okay, I think it was is it Robert Smith, the guy from the British Boxing Board of Control. He was like, we understand his ways of how he scored the fight, and he was downgraded from A star to A. You know,
Yeah, literally downgraded like barely anything.
so by this time next week, everyone will be talking about Errol Spence and Terence Crawford. Regardless of how that fight goes, that's going to take all the headlines. Naoya Inoue against Stephen Fulton is today's flavor of the week. And unfortunately, it will be forgotten about. You know, we'll bang on about it until the next time it happens, and then we'll reference Kambosos Hughes. So it is terribly frustrating. Maxi Hughes had his moment stolen from him, and you mentioned Louis DeBell, and his tweet saying that off the back of this he'll get other paydays and whatnot. But I was really pissed off at the way Louis DeBell put it, almost as if like, oh, don't worry, it's a bad call, but he'll still get paid. But would he have not got paid more for an IBF World Title fight with the likes of Shakur Stevenson if, as expected, Devin Haney vacates some belts and moves up? Imagine the money you would have got there. That one fight with Shakur Stevenson will probably be 5 times as much as he'll get in his next fight. So it's all well and good saying, yeah, he'll move on to next fights, but it'll be cannon fodder. You know, Kambosos and moving on a fight Shakur Stevenson. That's the in-house fight that they want at Top Rank, with Kambosos recently signing that deal with Top Rank. It all stinks of a business plan that Maxi Hughes had clearly pissed on, that he'd went in there and he'd done what he wasn't expected to do and put on a boxing clinic, and he beat the hometown, not the hometown fighter, but the home fighter, in terms of it was a top ranked show. Kambosos is a top ranked fighter. He wasn't meant to win. He had his moment stolen from him, and he's many times it's happened. And can you honestly, hand on heart, say that Maxi Hughes can go on and run again and get himself into a position where he's going to get an IBF final eliminator again? I really don't think so. You know, it's a glamour division, and unfortunately for Maxi, his face doesn't fit, and he was shit on from a great height.
Well, that's the thing. Like, obviously, I get what you're saying. I said Louis DeBella can promise him these paydays, but like you said, that one fight with Shakur Stevenson, he could like win or lose that fight, he'll be able to sit back and, you know, like, listen, I made my money, I can sit back and I can provide for my family now. And I'm sure he probably got paid very well for the Kambosos fight, but I think it's the legacy as well. Like, you know, he's called the Cinderella man. You know, just imagine how good it would have been for him to get, even if he didn't beat Shakur Stevenson, just to get himself in that position. If you could have looked at where he was, I don't know, 5 years ago, and Fims then say he fought for a world title headline in the States. And this is the thing, someone replied to my tweet. When I put my tweet up about saying that's just as bad as Jack Catterall versus Josh Taylor, someone replied saying Haney versus Loma as well. Haney versus Loma was a close fight. And as George Kambosos said himself, close fights aren't robberies. That fight was close. It wasn't a robbery. It was a fight that could have gone either way. I can always see the argument for Lomachenko. Some people obviously can see it for Haney. I'm not going to give my view because, to be honest, I can't fully remember the fight. It was a fair while back. But that fight wasn't close. That it was like, I saw Sam Jones say, and he said it was competitive but not close, and it wasn't. While George Kambosos never looked beat, he didn't really have much of a chance. If you were to sit there, that's it. I had this gut feeling. I actually put it on Twitter during round 6, saying I have a horrible feeling he's going to get robbed here, because obviously, like you said, he's not Kambosos wasn't the home fighter, but it was a top ranked show. He's a top ranked signed fighter. Maxi Hughes is a free agent. You can kind of see how it's going to go. I just thought it's that, like I said, it's that stuff that ruins the sport. There's so many good things happening in this sport, but it always gets overshadowed by the bad things. Luckily for Kambosos, that has come at a perfect time for him, because Josh Taylor, he still gets shit for it now. You can see it every day. He still gets told, when you're rematching Jack Catterall. And I think that fight is looking to get made next. Someone's put on Twitter saying that apparently Matchroom have reached out to Top Rank to make that fight. Hopefully we can see justice get served. But you know, for Kambosos, this fight has come right before Inoue versus Fulton and then Spence versus Crawford. It's like you said, that had the headline for what, Sunday, and not even Monday, because then on Monday all the headlines was obviously the weigh-ins for Inoue versus Fulton. So Maxi Hughes got his little day of, okay, this was fucking awful, but now look, it's the mega fight week. You got 2 months to fight in 1 week. So unfortunately, you know, you are right with Maxi Hughes said, like, you know, this is just going to get overshadowed now. This isn't going to get spoken about until, I don't know, when, I don't know, let's say Terence Crawford puts on an absolute clinic against fucking Errol Spence and gets robbed. We'll hear it then. But for years to come, this fight's going to get referenced as just another bad call from the judges. And like I said, I do want to see something change with these judges because it can't keep happening. Do you sit back and say, is there corruption, or are these judges just simply doing what impresses the promoter so they'll get called back? I don't know what they actually see. I'm never going to know what they see, but that's one of those unsolved mysteries, I think.
Absolutely. And I think in a day and age of, if you look at the upcoming boxing schedule, you've got Anthony Joshua rematching Dillian White. The first fight was a knockout win for Anthony Joshua after a dominant performance. You've got Chris Eubank rematching Liam Smith. Liam Smith knocks him out in 4 rounds conclusively. You've got Zhilei Zhang rematching Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce was punched from pillar to post and stopped in emphatic fashion by Zhilei Zhang. Those 3 rematches are happening within the next 8 weeks. Also, why is he not called for a rematch with George Kambosos and Maxi Hughes in a fight that one fighter was clearly robbed? Highly disputed victory for George Kambosos, we've clearly gone over. Where's the clamour for the rematch here? Where's Eddie Hearn is Maxi Hughes' promoter? I know he's a free agent, but he was working with him. You know, where's the clamour here to get the rematch on here? Because these are the kind of fights that should warrant an immediate rematch. The same as Catterall Josh Taylor should have been an immediate rematch. And the other fights that they're only rematching because they make financial sense for the promoters, like Joe Joyce. The rematch clause for a interim title doesn't make sense to me. Anthony Joshua, Dillian White, that's a rematch based off Eddie Hearn thinking this fight sells. Same with Chris Eubank and Liam Smith. Liam Smith wasn't meant to win that first fight, and Wasserman put in the rematch clause to protect their asset. But in a true sporting sense, Maxi Hughes has got more right to a rematch with George Kambosos than any of those 3 fights that we mentioned there. But you won't get one.
No, he won't. He won't. I think it's one of those ones where I think you got to look at it from a business perspective. It does it sell well on Top Rank's behalf? Probably does, yes, but it doesn't fit in with their plans. I think that's the thing. Obviously, he's mentioned Eddie Hearn getting this fight, but if he gets this fight, this rematch won't get made till sometime next year. And I'm sure Maxi, and then both of them came out fairly unscathed. You know, they both had a little cut, but they'll be healed up soon enough. And I'm sure they'll probably want to both. Well, Kambosos isn't going to want to get out by the end of the year because he's just going to wait to get his shot at the IBF now. But for Maxi Hughes, I don't think he wants to sit around and wait. And I think if there wasn't this eliminator and there wasn't now a mandatory, I think we would probably see more talks of a rematch. But I just don't think we'll see it because it was when you look at like Taylor versus Catterall, that was a fight. Okay, yes, Jack Catterall wasn't meant to being given a chance at all, but I think you got to look at the difference in situation. This was an eliminator. Catterall versus Taylor was for the undisputed world title. He was robbed on the biggest of stages. You know, you don't get a bigger fight than an undisputed title fight, whereas there's bigger fights to be made for, you know, George Kambosos. There's bigger fights to go on to now in terms of winning belts and stuff. So it's one of those ones. As much as we want to see it, we're not going to see it. Top Rank are going to send George Kambosos off to try and reclaim his world titles, which I don't think he will. I really do not see him beating anyone up there. And as for Maxi Hughes, I don't know where he's going to go next because Louis DeBella can promise him these big fights, but will he be a man of his word and actually give him these big fights? And the other thing is, who do you give to Maxi Hughes next? Who is going to be on that same level as Kambosos to make him that money? And that's the other question.
So, guys, as promised, we will end on a high. We will be the teacher to the pupil, and we'll end on a positive. And as a boxing fan, Josh, and our listeners, our viewers, it doesn't get any better than this. If you was to go back to 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 20, 21, 22, and you was to ask any boxing fan that knows boxing, what one fight do you want to see? Errol Spence against Terence Crawford. You know, and over the years, there's been the Canelo and Golovkin, there's been Fury against Joshua, there's been Joshua against Wilder, but nothing has stood the test of time the way us boxing fans have wanted Errol Spence against Terence Crawford. And the fact now that between them, they've accumulated all the world titles at 147 pounds, with Errol holding the WBC, WBA, and IBF, and the WBO belonging to Terence Crawford. The Ring magazine will be chucked in there. Pound for pound supremacy, welterweight supremacy. This is the biggest boxing fight I can think of since Mayweather Pacquiao. And I put the tweet out the other day, and people saying, in terms of events, you've got the likes of even Mayweather McGregor. That was a freak show, and that sold millions and millions of pay-per-views. Canelo against Golovkin 1, 2, and 3. Fury, Klitschko, Fury, Wilder. There's of course been big fights, but this is truly the best fight in the best. And as I say, Josh, it doesn't get much better than this, does it?
I think it's one of those fights that's been built over the years as well. I think the reason why there's so much hype around it now is because of how long we've been wanting to see it. Back in 2016, I'm not going to be honest, I wasn't even a boxing fan back then. That's when I was in my football days and I love football. But, when you get into boxing, one of the first things you realize is Spence versus Crawford is one of those fights that just had to get made. When you look at these other big fights that you mentioned, those fights got made. Okay, yes, not straight away, but they got made in the end. Whereas this one has took what 7 years in the making, would you say? So for it to finally be here, it's just amazing. It's what you want to see. It's almost like what people say in 2023, the year big fights are getting made. Apart from the heavyweight division, you're seeing the big fights get made everywhere else. And I think this is the one that really tops off. And we're only in July as well. It's only July, and we've seen all these big fights get made. And this one, even at the end of it, this will sit at the top. And isn't there a rematch clause going both ways as well? Like, regardless of what happens, there'll be a second fight.
Yeah, I believe so. And, I agree with what you're saying there. This being the year of the big fights. And it's almost like a domino effect. That it only took that one big fight. So when it was signed, it was, of course, Ryan Garcia against Tank Davis. And it's had a domino effect. And, even the not the subpar, that's a disrespectful term to use, but, the likes of Beterbiev against Yard, Eubank Smith the first time around, Wood and Lara 1 and 2. There's been other fights. It's just that was the regular year on year. They was the kind of fights that we was getting. This year is the super fights. Inoue Fulton we've touched on very well in this episode. That's another one that's up there, and hopefully this is a trend that continues to happen. And if we get the likes of Beterbiev and Bivol in the ring later on this year, and Usyk and Fury in December, fingers crossed, as highly as unlikely as that seems. But it does seem the year of the big fights, and long may it continue. But in terms of Spence Crawford, it fell out of bed so many times. It did feel like it was never going to happen at one point. More than one point, it felt like it was never going to happen. I think, along with it being the year of the big fights, and there was the pressure there for guys to finally sign the contracts and make these fights, I think this was the very last point for which this fight could happen, where we couldn't accuse each of the fighters to be out, or any of the fighters to be out of their prime. I think this is it now. Crawford at 35, 36, Spence at a few years younger. Spence with his outer ring issues looks flawless in the ring, as is Crawford. But in terms of their physical peaks, I think this is the very limit of where we could have sold it as prime versus prime. Some good up and coming fight, Jaron Ennis. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that he could have stepped up and got a mandatory shot at one of the two and beat them, and then all of a sudden Spence and Crawford doesn't have that buzz around it. But it is happening. It goes down. What do you sit on? Before we get into the sporting side of things, the business, as we know, boxing is a business. Spence versus Crawford. Do you agree that Errol Spence is the A side in this fight?
I'd say yeah, just based on the fact obviously PBC are promoting it, and I'm sure when you look at both of their most recent fights, obviously. Crawford's most recent fight was with that PLK, wasn't it, against David Avanesian, who actually trains in Nottingham, believe it or not. David Avanesian actually trains in Newark, just down the road from me.
Carl Greaves,
and then obviously,
Carl Greaves.
Very good man. Love Carl Greaves, got a lot of respect for him. But when you look at obviously Errol Spence, obviously I know when was the last time? Was it Ugas that he last fought, and that was what, last April?
Yeah,
But I'm sure it was a PBC show as well.
of course.
So
Yeah.
I think he's the A side, but a very small A side. So I'm fairly sure the rematch clause goes both ways.
Mm-hmm.
But that's obviously just due to how big of a fight it is. But the thing that I was going to ask you is, do you think the delay has made this fight even bigger than what it was? Because obviously people wanted it back in 2016, but if it got made in 2016, do you reckon there would have been as much hype around it as what there is now? Because obviously boxing as a sport has grew a lot. So I think now, would you almost say this is the perfect time for it?
Yeah, I'd say obviously we've got to account for the COVID period, taking out 2 years or 18 months of boxing action. I think had this is one thing that is going to play into my prediction in a way is Errol Spence with the issues that he's had out of the ring with the car crashes and whatnot. He's had damage to one of his eyes as well. The car crash was horrific, and it was an absolute blessing that he was not only able to box again, but even to breathe again. You know, it was such an horrendous car crash. It's a horrible accident that it's a blessing that he's even breathing. So to answer your question, it probably isn't, but due to circumstances out of the ring, then this is as good as it's getting. As I said before, this is the very peak of the prime. But you'd argue maybe 2020, had it not been for the pandemic, late 2020 would have been the absolute golden moment for me. But that's not to take away from this weekend, not at all.
No, this weekend is massive. It is absolutely massive. And you know what? If we're talking from a business and money perspective, I think it's a good value pay-per-view price as well for once. I think £19.95 in the UK. I think it's a fair price for a fight of this magnitude. Obviously, I know it's not ideal prime time in the UK, but I think you'll still see a lot of people in the UK and around Europe and all these other places stay up, or even in some places like Japan. You know, obviously we've had boxing midday here. Some places are going to have it midday there. I think it's one of those fights again. Like I said when we spoke about Inoue versus Lomachenko as the fantasy fight, it's one of those fights that people are going to sit around, gather, and watch together. Even people who aren't big hardcore boxing fans like me and you, they're going to sit down and watch it because they know these two names. These are two household names. These are two names that you can go to someone and say, "Do you know this man?" They'll be like, "Oh yeah, I've heard of him." As I think this fight is massive. I think the numbers it will do will be huge as well. I think it will do massive numbers.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And, you know, shout out to TNT Sports as it is now, and it's not BT Sports anymore. But shout out to TNT Sports for getting hold of this. I think it's a real coup for Frank Warren, and obviously he's got his Queensbury show on the Saturday night with Liam Davis against Jason Cunningham. Great domestic fight, and I always like when you have, you know, a good solid domestic card that leads into the mega fights. It's like the old days of having the UK show leading into the American shows, and you know, you have that debate when it gets to around 11:30, 12 o'clock. Do a chance a couple of hours sleep? You know, do a set an alarm? Do a try and soldier on and stay up all the way through? It's a great conundrum to have because either way, we know that there's a good fight to go up for. Yeah, I think it's a competitive price. I think it was a genius move for TNT Sports in the wake of the uproar around Anthony Joshua Dillian White 2 being announced at $26.95, which is absurd. For them then to secure the rights to the biggest fight of the year, the biggest fight of the decade, and then put it on it cheaper. And I know obviously the casual fans aren't going to know Spence Crawford the way they might know Anthony Joshua, Dillian White, but I thought it was a real coup for them. One, to get it, one for him to market it the way they have, and one to price point it less than Joshua White, because then you can always look at it and be like, do you want two past the primes heavyweight that are rematching in a fight that doesn't really mean anything, or do you want this fight that in 20 years we're going to be referencing as this was the fight of our era? So yeah, I think it's very well priced. But we're moving to one of the arguments that come up between Errol Spence and Crawford, and certainly the fans, especially when Crawford was with ESPN, A side, B side, all that kind of thing. But since Crawford moved into the welterweight division, he won world titles at 135. He was undisputed at 140. And he's knocked every opponent out that he's fought at welterweight. You know, the likes of, started off with Jeff Horn, stopped him in 9 rounds. Benavidez stopped him in 12. Khan, Kavaluskas, Brook, Porter, Avanesian. It's a solid run of form. But after each one of those, the question was asked, you know, take away Jeff Horn, he had to get into the division and win a title, which he did. But from that moment of winning that fight, when are you going to fight Errol Spence? Spence himself, I think it's quite interesting, or by pure coincidence, that since Crawford won his welterweight title and Spence has won his world title at welterweight, they've both had 7 fights, fought some common opponents as well. But Spence, he stopped Brook in 11 rounds to win the title, as we know, and then he's beat Peterson, stoppage, stopped Ocampo in 1 round, Mike Garcia, unanimous decision, Sean Porter, split decision, Danny Garcia, unanimous decision, and then Ugas, he stopped in 10 rounds. Now, the one that stands out for me, and you might have a difference of opinion, Josh, was after coming back from that accident, and I've already touched on how bad that was, his comeback fight was Danny Garcia. You know, that's no mean touch, a former 2-weight world champion, and a good fighter in his own right. To come back and fight somebody of that ilk that quick and to beat him in the dominant fashion that he had, I thought was really, really impressive. But of the two, who do you think's got the better resume? And I pose the question to the listeners as well. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram at SimBoxx1. Who do you think's got the better resume at 147 pounds?
I don't know. It's a tough one. It is. Oh. I kind of want to lean towards Spence ever so slightly because they're two very, very good resumes. Obviously, I think the other way you could compare it is how they've dealt with their opponents. When you spoke about Spence's list, it was a lot of decision wins, and you spoke about Terence Crawford, it was just knockout after knockout after knockout. But I would lean towards Spence just because when you talk of the name Spence, I want to say he had those before Terence Crawford got his hands on them. Obviously Brock. When he fought Kell Brook, Errol Spence, he came to Kell Brook's back garden. He went to the Bramall Lane and literally beat him up there, beat him in front of his own home fans. I've not seen Terence Crawford do something like that. I might be wrong, but I don't recall him doing anything like that. Like when you look at the fights individually,
the lighter weights, when he come over and he fought Ricky Burns in Scotland, but at welterweight, yeah, I definitely agree. He's not gone on the road and beat someone the way Spence beat Brook.
Yeah, so I would give it. I'd say the better resume goes to Errol Spence ever so slightly.
Yeah, and we also know styles make fights. It's an old cliche, but Crawford has dealt with people quicker or more emphatically than Spence has. But then you could say, Kell Brook, when he went in and fought Errol Spence, he put up a really good fight, and he was ultimately stopped on another eye injury, devastating eye injury. But he was really acquitting himself well in that fight with Errol Spence. Then he went 4 rounds in the bubble with Terence Crawford. But you could say, was Kell Brook the same fighter when he fought Crawford? I don't think he was. And the same with Sean Porter. Sean Porter and Errol Spence was one of my fights of the year that year. It was a great fight. Went to a split decision win for Errol Spence, whereas Terence Crawford a couple of years later knocks him out conclusively. So on paper, if you look at it without looking at the dates and the locations and this, that, and the other, it looks more emphatic from Crawford. But as you say, if you kind of break it down and you read between the lines a little bit, is Errol Spence taking on the fresher opponents? The one that sticks out for me is Mikey Garcia. I remember that's the one time between the two of them at welterweight that I was. It's difficult to be critical of someone that was so dominant, but I thought for a much bigger man in Errol Spence taking on Mikey Garcia, his own right is a great fighter. But he had no business being up at 147 fighting Errol Spence. He dominated him without really putting his foot to the pedal. And some people say, why should he? He's cruising to a victory, but that animal in him that dog in him should have wanted him to put his pedal to the floor and look to get Mikey out there, but he cruised to a point decision. Fair play, he got the win. But yeah, that's the one that sticks out to me where I think that's quite underwhelmed there.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes a fighter just doesn't need. I don't know if he's doing it comfortably. If he took that risk and, well, I say a risk, but if he put his foot down, he might have opened himself a bit more of a risk. He would have been letting his hands go more. I think there's always no matter what story you're telling, there's always a flip side to it. There's with every bit you can gain, there's also that bit you could lose. And maybe he just didn't want to up the levels. Maybe he wanted to keep it simple, keep it calm, and just win an easy little point decision or whatever it was. So I don't know. I think it's one of those ones. It just depends on how the fighter's feeling. Obviously, as a fan, you want to see him. You want to see a fighter go through the gears and hopefully finish it with a big knockout. But we're not always going to get that, because if we got that, I don't think the sport would be as fun. That's just my opinion, though.
Yeah, I certainly agree. So, Josh, this is what we're here for. We don't sit on the fence on the Let's Talk Boxing podcast. It's prediction times. So, Errol Spence versus Terence Crawford. The undisputed welterweight titles are on the line. Pound for pound supremacy is on the line, and to be considered a generational great, the best in your era, in your division, is up for grabs here for both men. So hit me with it, Josh. Give me your keys to victory and ultimately your prediction for the fight.
Right, with the prediction, do I need to give an exact round or just how I think it's going to go? And then
how confident are you feeling?
It's one of those fights. It's one of those fights where you never like. I'm going to say something, and I'm not going to sit on the fence with my answer, but I'm telling you now, I'll go away tomorrow and I'll have a different answer. If I were to sit here now, I would say Terence Crawford, just based on the fact of activity. I know he's not been very active this year, but when you look at obviously I know it's through no fault of Errol Spence's that he's not been able to fight. Obviously, him recovering from that car accident was much more important than anything else. Like you said, we're blessed that he's still breathing, let alone boxing again. But I just think there's something about Terence Crawford. I think his IQ, the activity, I think there's all of that. When you pile it all together, I don't think it'll be too much. I think it'll be a very tight little points decision, but I think it'll be like a little close points decision, like a 116, 112, something like that.
Interesting. Now, as I say, we don't sit on the fence. Now, in terms of my prediction, it's as much as it's a close fight, it's a uber competitive fight, and you could ask 100 people, and it'll 51 will say Crawford, and 49 will say Spence, and maybe the other way around. But for me, I've always been behind Terence Crawford in this fight, and I love Errol Spence. Every time I watch him, I think, is this the guy that I'm backing against? But then I watch Crawford again, and I'm like, yeah, Crawford's got that dog in him, and I think they've both got the dog in him to an extent that's why it's such a competitive fight. The skill, the ring IQ, the ring generalship, that's all in there. But you break it all down. These guys have come from nothing into two of the very best boxers of their era, and they've still kept that dog in them. They're multi-millionaires, but they've still got that dog in them, that will to win. And for me, gun to my head, it's Terence Crawford, and it always has been. And I'd be even as confident as to say that I think Terence Crawford will stop Errol Spence. I think it'll be cagey, tactical. Both men, they've had big fights, but this is by far and away the biggest fight of their careers. So you could see it being contentious early on, and a bit cagey. But I think ultimately Terence Crawford, I think his shot selection, his combinations will be telling. Errol will have his moments, but I think he'll start working away to the body, and I don't think Errol Spence is the fighter he was. I think Terence Crawford is going to make a hell of a statement, and then the argument then becomes who's pound for pound number one? Is it Naoya Inoue or is it Terence Crawford? But we'll save that conversation for next week's episode. But my prediction: Terence Crawford by TKO between rounds 9 and 12.
So I was going to say, I wanted to get a little round there. 9 to 12, I think is fair. I don't. When you say that, again, see, like I say, I'll change my mind, and I feel like that the way you've described it there again, it's got me thinking again. But I'm going to stick with Terence Crawford points. But I'm very excited for it. And we've got the great little feeder before that of Liam Davies versus Jason Cunningham in Telford. I'm sure you'll see all the little boards around ringside. It'll all be Spence versus Crawford tonight live on TNT. I think it's a great little fight to have just to feed into it. It's like you said, domestic matchup. It reminds me of back before Fury Wilder 2. And we had Brad Foster headline at York Hall. And then straight afterwards, I remember I sat there with my cousin and we had to debate on whether we were going to stay up or just go to bed and wake up for the fight. We ended up going to bed. 14-year-old me could not hack an all-nighter. But it's got that big fight feeling. It's not fully kicked in yet for me, but I think come Saturday night, when I'm on my way back home from Telford, I think I'll really be sat there about it's happening. And I'll tell you now, while I'll be shattered after going back and forth between ringside and backstage in Telford, I will be staying up and watching this fight because it's one of those fights that you just can't miss, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I just can't wait for it. And if you're not fully in festival spirit ahead of the fight, I applaud the listeners and the viewers as well as yourself, Josh. Go and check out the build-up programs from Showtime. These you get stuff over here for our UK shows, but there's nothing like PBC and Top Rank this and Showtime, ESPN. They knock it out the park. And is it all access, all areas, or all access? I love these for the big fights. And you see him training, and you go behind the cameras, and the work with the dietitians. That for me really lights the fire. And I've watched them both already because it's part 1 and part 2. But I can guarantee you, I'll watch them again before fight night. They're absolutely fans of flames for me. And if you want to get in the spirit, it's like being at Christmas and you watch Home Alone 1 and 2 to get yourself in that festive spirit, and you watch the Santa Claus. Access all areas is Home Alone for boxing fans.
I might have to go sit down and watch these right after this, but it's just glad that we're glad that it's here. I think boxing fans can come together as a community this week, and while you go on Twitter and you always see boxing fans debating, arguing, and doing this, that, and the other, I think this is one fight this weekend where all the fans will come together and just say, "Do you know what? We've been asking for this for years. It's here." And then I think a lot of fans like yourself, I think they're already there in the spirit of how long they've been waiting for it. But I'll go watch the all access videos after this. And I can probably tell you that after that I'll be ready for it, and I'll be more than excited for it.
Absolutely. As we say, guys, there is the card on TNT Sports, formerly known as BT Sports, with Liam Davis headlining a title fight against Jason Cunningham. Our very own Josh Hart will be there on behalf of his channel, JTH Boxing. Make sure you're checking him out on Twitter, Instagram, and, of course, subscribe to his YouTube channel. We will review that in next week's episode, so we don't want to get on the wrong side of Frank Warren and act like we've missed out that fight, but we will review that on next week's episode. But for the time being, guys, welcome back to the Let's Talk Boxing podcast. As always, I've been your host, Luke SimBoxx. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram. Always up for a debate about boxing. Make sure you're following our main page at SimBoxx1 on Twitter. Subscribe to the YouTube channel below. Hit us up in the comments on any subjects you want us to take on. We'll be looking at bringing guests on in the future. It's going to be the start of an exciting journey, bringing the podcast back to where it was. Josh, give your channel, give yourself a bit of a plug.
Listen, everyone listening at home, obviously, I'm Josh. Just go subscribe to JTH Boxing. Obviously, I just do interviews. You'll tend to see me at various different fight weeks. So go subscribe, JTH Boxing. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. You can catch me there. Lucas wants to say thank you for bringing me on. And like I said, this is the start of a very exciting journey. And I cannot wait for next week already when we'll be able to review all these big fights.
Absolutely. Look forward to it. As always, guys, this podcast will be available in audio and video format. It'll be on the YouTube channel. It'll be on Spotify. It'll be on Apple Podcasts, all other major podcast outlets. Make sure you're subscribing and leaving reviews. It helps us build and become better and bring better content. In the meantime, check out JTH for all his build-up content to the Telford show, and we will catch you on next week's episode.